Abandoned at 5 months old by a mother who refused to name him, Lemuel Haynes was born into a world designed to keep him in the margins, an illegitimate indentured servant in a society defined by rigid hierarchies. Yet, by the flickering orange glow of a colonial fireplace, this young boy spent his nights mastering Greek and Latin, refusing to allow the boundaries of his birth to dictate the horizons of his mind. He would grow to defend the colonies with a musket at Ticonderoga, but his most enduring legacy was forged with a pen and a Bible. By dismantling the racial and theological barriers of the 18th century, using the very logic of his detractors, the man known as the Black Puritan proved that while society may cast a soul aside, Providence operates by a different architecture. This is a life that transformed the stigma of abandonment into a pioneering ministry of spiritual and intellectual authority. The narrative of the American experiment is often told through the lens of well-born statesmen and established aristocrats, yet the true depth of the nation's spiritual and social transformation is frequently found in the margins. Lemuel Haynes stands as a towering, if sometimes overlooked, figure whose life defied the rigid social stratifications of the 18th century. Born into the double marginalization of illegitimate birth and racial prejudice, Haynes did not merely survive his circumstances. He transcended them to become a premier intellectual and spiritual force in the early republic. His life serves as a profound case study in the intersection of Reformed theology and the burgeoning American identity. As the first African American ordained by a mainstream Protestant denomination, Haynes represented a living bridge between the First and Second Great Awakenings. His ministry was not defined by a narrow focus on his own racial identity, but by an unwavering commitment to the doctrines of grace and the sovereignty of a God who, in Haynes's view, orchestrated the minutiae of human history for his own glory. To understand Haynes is to understand a man who viewed his own abandonment not as a tragic end, but as a divine prologue to a life of pioneering ministry. Today, we seek to unpack the layers of his development, from the furrowed fields of Massachusetts to the influential pulpits of Vermont, exploring the internal and external forces that forged the Black Puritan. The arrival of Lemuel Haynes into the world on July 18, 1753, in West Hartford, Connecticut, occurred under a cloud of social stigma and material destitution. In the context of colonial New England, the circumstances of his birth, the illegitimate offspring of a black father and a white mother, placed him at the absolute nadir of the social hierarchy. The early abandonment by his mother left him without the foundational protection of a biological family, leading a contemporary to remark that he was born into the worst kind of orphanage. His very name was an act of detachment, derived not from his lineage, but from the owner of the house where he first drew breath. However, what appeared to be a series of unfortunate accidents was, in the framework of Haynes's later theology, the precise arrangement of a sovereign God. The mechanics of his redemption from these circumstances began at the age of 5 months, when he was indentured to the family of David Rose in Granville, Massachusetts. Indenture was a harsh reality of the era, yet for Haynes, the specific character of the Rose family served as the primary instrument of his preservation and eventual flourishing. The Rose family provided a domestic environment that was atypical for a servant of that period. David Rose, a deacon influenced by the fervor of the Great Awakening, modeled a singular piety that Haynes would later recall with deep reverence. This period of American history was marked by a shift from cold traditionalism to an experiential, heartfelt religion, and Haynes was immersed in this spiritual climate from his earliest years. The maternal influence of Mrs. Rose was equally pivotal. While the legal status of Haynes was that of a servant bound until the age of 21, the emotional reality was far more integrated. Mrs. Rose's peculiar attachment to Lemuel led her to treat him as her own child, providing the psychological stability necessary for an abandoned boy to develop a sense of worth and belonging. Despite the grueling labor required on the colonial frontier, Haynes noted that his workload was commensurate with the rest of the family. This parity in labor, coupled with his inclusion in family devotions and church attendance, effectively blurred the lines between servant and son, fostering a resilience that would sustain him in later years. The development of Haynes's formidable intellect was the result of a relentless personal drive operating within the limited opportunities afforded by the Rose family. While he attended school as much as his chores permitted, the bulk of his education was self-directed. By the flickering light of the hearth in the early morning and late evening, Haynes mastered the tools of literacy through three primary texts: a spelling book, a hymn book, and the Bible. This trifecta of resources ensured that his linguistic development was inextricably linked to theological and rhythmic expression. This intellectual growth was not merely academic, it was the catalyst for an intense internal spiritual struggle. The Reformed preaching of the era often emphasized the holiness of God and the depravity of man, leading the young Haynes to experience fearful apprehensions regarding his eternal state. He interpreted natural phenomena, such as the northern lights, as omens of the impending day of judgment, reflecting a mind deeply saturated in the apocalyptic imagery of the scriptures. The resolution of this inner turmoil occurred in a moment of solitary reflection, a quintessential new light conversion experience. One evening, while mourning his wretched condition beneath an apple tree, Haynes reached a point of spiritual surrender where he found the Savior. This transition from a religion of fear to one of personal faith was the cornerstone of his life's work. It transformed him from a servant of the roses into a servant of Christ, providing the internal motivation to pursue a calling that, by all social measures of the 1770s, should have been inaccessible to him. This early synthesis of hard labor, rigorous self-study, and profound spiritual encounter prepared him for the next chapter of his life, the physical and ideological battle for American independence. As Lemuel Haynes reached the age of 21 in 1774, his period of legal indenture concluded, granting him a personal autonomy that coincided with the colony's own pursuit of self-determination. The transition from a bound servant to a free citizen was not merely a change in legal status. It was the catalyst for Haynes to apply his deeply held theological convictions to the political crisis of his day. The mechanics of Haynes's involvement in the American Revolution were driven by a synthesis of civic duty and a new light understanding of liberty. Joining the Minutemen in Granville, he was among those who marched to Roxbury following the news of the clashes at Lexington and Concord. In 1776, he participated in the arduous expedition to Ticonderoga. For Haynes, the approach of his military service was inextricably linked to the root of his moral philosophy. He did not view the struggle for independence as a secular enlightenment project, but as a providential movement for justice. During this period, he drafted a significant, though then unpublished, essay titled Liberty Further Extended. In this document, Haynes utilized the logic of the Declaration of Independence to argue that the natural rights being claimed by the colonists were inherently universal. He posited that if liberty was an unalienable gift from the Creator, then the institution of chattel slavery was not merely a political inconsistency, but a direct rebellion against the divine order. The cessation of his military service marked a shift from physical combat to intellectual and spiritual preparation. Despite the lack of formal university access, Haynes sought out private theological training, a common pathway for aspiring ministers in the 18th century. He studied under the tutelage of Daniel Brinsmade and later the influential Job Swift. The primary engine of his development during this phase was an intense immersion in the Hebrew and Greek languages. Haynes recognized that to be an exegete in the Word of God, he had to bypass translations and engage with the original manuscripts. This academic rigor served a dual purpose. It bolstered his authority in a society that questioned the intellectual capacity of his race, and it ensured that his later preaching would be anchored in precise exegesis rather than mere emotionalism. By 1780, his proficiency was such that he was invited to preach in his home congregation, leading to his licensure and, eventually, his historic ordination in 1785. The most prolific era of Haynes's life began with his call to the West Parish of Rutland, Vermont, in 1788. For 30 years, he served a predominantly white congregation, a phenomenon that remains nearly unparalleled in American ecclesiastical history. This tenure was not a result of a post-racial utopia in Vermont, but rather a testament to Haynes's undeniable mastery of the new divinity, a rigorous branch of Edwardsian Calvinism. Haynes's ministry was defined by a relentless focus on the character of God. In his view, the pulpit was the primary instrument for rightly dividing the word of truth. He did not seek to entertain his congregants, but to humble them before the majesty of a holy God. His preaching style was characterized by a logical transparency. He would state a doctrine, provide the scriptural evidence, and then relentlessly apply the implications to the lives of his listeners. The blueprint for his success in a white congregation lay in his ability to transcend the visual reality of his race through the auditory power of his orthodoxy. To the settlers of Vermont, Haynes was the voice of the Great Awakening. He spoke their spiritual language with more precision and passion than many of his white contemporaries. This shared theological framework created a bond of spiritual kinship that, for 3 decades, proved stronger than the social prejudices of the era. One of the most famous episodes of his Rutland ministry occurred in 1805, following a sermon by the noted Universalist Hosea Ballou. Ballou argued that a loving God would never consign any soul to eternal punishment. Haynes, who happened to be in the audience, was invited to respond. His rebuttal, later published as the sermon Universal Salvation, a very ancient doctrine, is a masterpiece of satirical polemics. Rather than using dry academic jargon, Haynes identified the first Universalist preacher as the serpent in the Garden of Eden, who told Eve, "Ye shall not surely die." By framing universalism as the original satanic deception, Haynes effectively used the internal logic of the Bible to dismantle Ballou's position. The sermon became an international bestseller, reprinted dozens of times across the Atlantic, cementing Haynes's reputation as a premier defender of New England orthodoxy. Through these years, Haynes demonstrated that the reason behind a successful ministry was not found in cultural relevance or social standing, but in an unwavering commitment to what he perceived as timeless, objective truth. His life in Rutland was the ultimate expression of his belief that the providence which saved him under an apple tree was the same providence that governed the hearts of all men, regardless of their station. The journey from a licensed preacher to a fully settled pastor was not a simple progression of success. Rather, it was a season marked by profound personal integration and the endurance of social friction. The early 1780s served as a laboratory for Haynes, where the abstract theological truths he had mastered were applied to the intimate spheres of family life and the public challenges of racial prejudice. In 1783, while serving as a pulpit supply in Middle Granville, Massachusetts, Haynes entered into a marriage that defied the prevailing social taboos of the era. His union with Elizabeth Babbitt, a white schoolteacher, was initiated by her own proposal. In a society where interracial relationships were often viewed with hostility, this marriage stood as a quiet yet radical testament to their shared values and mutual respect. The way this partnership functioned was essential to Haynes's long-term sustainability in ministry. Elizabeth was not merely a domestic partner. She was a convert to the faith under his own preaching. Their relationship was built upon a foundation of shared, experimental religion, the idea that faith must be personally felt and lived out. This domestic stability provided a sanctuary for Haynes as he navigated the complexities of being a pioneer in a predominantly white denomination. Following his formal ordination in 1785, a historic milestone as the first African American ordained by a mainstream American denomination, Haynes accepted a call to Torrington, Connecticut. It was here that the theoretical egalitarianism of the gospel met the hard reality of human bias. One particular incident in Torrington illustrates the specific means by which Haynes disarmed his critics. A local man, deeply offended by the prospect of a black pastor, attended a service with the explicit intent of showing disrespect by keeping his hat on his head. However, the process of Haynes's preaching, characterized by a scholarly yet passionate delivery, began to erode the man's defenses. As the sermon progressed, the weight of the biblical exposition overwhelmed the man's social conditioning. He eventually removed his hat and placed it under his seat in a gesture of silent submission to the truth being proclaimed. This encounter highlights a recurring theme in Haynes's life. He did not combat prejudice through political activism alone, but by a level of excellence and spiritual authority that rendered bigotry unsustainable in the presence of his ministry. While Haynes is often remembered for his pastoral longevity in Rutland, his intellectual contributions to the New Divinity movement provide the necessary context for his views on social reform and human rights. The New Divinity was an American theological tradition that sought to apply the rigorous logic of Jonathan Edwards to the pressing issues of the young republic. For decades, some historians suggested that Haynes was silent on the issue of slavery, but the 1980s discovery of his manuscript Liberty Further Extended dismantled this assumption. In this work, Haynes argues that the doctrines of grace are the ultimate foundation for human equality. The logic he employed was devastatingly simple. If all men are equally fallen and equally in need of a sovereign savior, then no man possesses a natural right to dominate another based on skin color. He utilized his mastery of New England theology to demonstrate that the oppression of Africans was a direct violation of the benevolence God requires of his creatures. By rooting his anti-slavery convictions in theology rather than just secular philosophy, Haynes provided a framework that resonated deeply with the religious population of New England, making him a critical, if quiet, architect of the early abolitionist sentiment. The final years of his Rutland ministry were complicated by the shifting political sands of the early 1800s. Haynes was a staunch Washingtonian Federalist, a political stance that eventually put him at odds with a growing number of his congregants who favored Jeffersonian republicanism. This political friction, combined with internal church discipline disputes, eventually led to his dismissal after 30 years of service. The tenor of this parting was bittersweet. Ruefully, Haynes noted that it was only during this period of intense disagreement that his race seemed to become a primary issue for his detractors, famously remarking that it was as if they had suddenly discovered he was black after 3 decades of leadership. Yet, true to his belief in providence, Haynes did not retire in bitterness. He continued to serve smaller congregations in Manchester, Vermont, and Granville, New York, until his death in 1833, proving that his calling was never dependent on the approval of a specific congregation, but on his commission from Christ. Lemuel Haynes died as one of the most respected and extraordinary Christian preachers in American history. He left behind a legacy that challenges modern categories. He was a Black Puritan who mastered the white intellectual world of his day, not by conforming to it, but by excelling within it to the point that his voice could not be ignored. Today, he is celebrated as a foundational figure in African American Christianity and a model of how a life surrendered to a sovereign God can transform abandonment into a pioneering legacy. Lemuel Haynes viewed every hardship, from the stigma of his birth to the grueling labor of his youth, not as an obstacle to his calling, but as the very tool God used to forge his character. Take a moment to consider the unlikely beginnings or silent struggles in your own life. Are there circumstances you currently view as abandonment that might actually be providential placement? Haynes found his purpose in a moment of solitary surrender. Where is your apple tree, that place of quiet reflection where you can distinguish the noise of the world from the doctrines of grace? Haynes disarmed his critics through the sheer weight of his mastery and integrity. In what areas of your life are you called to pursue a level of excellence that renders prejudice and opposition irrelevant? If the intellectual rigor and social courage of Lemuel Haynes resonate with you, don't let the conversation end here. The intersection of faith, history, and culture requires constant navigation and a commitment to rightly dividing the word of truth. Join our community at Theology today. By subscribing, you will receive weekly videos on the why and how behind church history and modern doctrine, access to exclusive long-form biographies on overlooked figures who shaped the spiritual landscape, videos that bridge the gap between academic theology and accessible lived faith. Click here to subscribe to Theology today, equipping the modern mind with timeless truth.